We always hear that more choices are better, right?
Right.
Especially, I think, when we're learning something new. Like if you're trying to learn a new skill and you see this huge list of courses you could take, or let's say you want to deep dive into a certain topic, and you go to the bookstore or you go online and there's just this massive amount of books.
Yeah.
Your first thought is, oh, fantastic, so many choices, I'm bound to find the perfect thing for me.
Yeah, you think I'll definitely find the perfect book or course or whatever.
Right. But have you ever run into that situation where you actually have too many choices?
Hmm.
And rather than feeling motivated, you just feel totally overwhelmed and kind of paralyzed?
Absolutely.
Oh,
I think we've all had those moments where you're just like, oh my gosh, where do I even begin?
exactly. And for our listeners who I think really value getting to the core of things quickly and thoroughly and really appreciate those light bulb moments,
Yeah.
it seems like choice can either be this thing that really propels you forward in your learning,
Hmm.
or it can be something that just becomes a huge obstacle.
Right. A barrier to even getting started.
So in today's deep dive, we're going to try to get to the bottom of this whole choice question and really figure out, when does choice motivate you and when does it totally backfire?
Right. When is it helpful and when does it actually hurt?
And to do this, we are looking at an article from the world of educational psychology called When Choice Motivates and When It Does Not by Idit Katz and Avi Asor.
Right.
And one of the reasons I was so drawn to this article is that they really go broad
Yeah.
and look across many years' worth of studies on choice.
Yeah, they take kind of a meta view.
Exactly. And they try to reconcile all these seemingly contradictory findings,
Yeah.
where sometimes choice seems like this amazing motivator, and other times it just seems to have no effect or even a negative effect.
It's almost like, what's going on here?
Right. So our mission today is to help you understand Katz and Asser's framework, which is rooted in something called self-determination theory, so that you can have a better sense of, okay, when is offering choices for myself, or maybe if I'm teaching other people, when is it going to lead to better motivation, deeper learning, greater well-being, and when might it not be such a good thing?
Right. So we can be more thoughtful about the choices we offer.
Exactly. So let's just jump right in with this idea of self-determination theory, or SDT.
Okay.
Now, I know our listeners are probably familiar with the basics of psychological theories, but just to give everyone a starting point,
Yeah.
what would you say is the most important takeaway from SDT?
Well, I think the key idea of SDT is that it looks at how our social context and the environments we're in really shape who we are and how motivated we are.
Okay.
It suggests that, we have these three basic psychological needs. And when those needs are satisfied, we tend to thrive. And, we're more intrinsically motivated.
Okay, so what are these three big needs that SDT talks about?
Well, the first one is autonomy. And that's really about, feeling a sense of choicefulness and feeling like your actions and your goals come from you, from your true self.
Okay.
And the second one is relatedness, which is about feeling close and connected to other people.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third one is competence, which is really about feeling effective and capable,
Okay.
feeling like you can interact with your environment and master new skills.
Okay, so the idea is, if we have a strong sense of autonomy and we feel connected to other people and we feel competent, then we are going to be much more likely to be internally driven to learn and grow.
Right, exactly.
And the assumption is that choice plays into this, especially in supporting our need for autonomy.
Right, exactly. And, this is sort of, I think, where things get a little bit complicated. Because the idea is that if you offer people choices, that will help them to feel more autonomous.
Yeah.
But I think what SDT and what this article is pointing out is that choice can be a little bit more nuanced than that. It's not just about having options.
Okay, so it's not as simple as just, here are 5 things, pick one.
Right, exactly. It's not just about, picking something from a list. It's more about a deeper sense of self-direction.
So when does choice actually support autonomy? When does it actually make you feel more free and more in charge of your own learning?
Well, I think the first key takeaway is that choices are more motivating when the options that are presented are related to your existing interests and your goals.
Okay.
So, for example, if you have a goal of, let's say, learning how to play the guitar,
Right.
and someone gives you a choice between, like, learning a certain song on the guitar versus learning how to bake a cake,
Right.
even though you're being given a choice, it doesn't really feel very meaningful.
Right, because it's not connected to your existing goals.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, there's some really interesting research on this.
Yeah, and they highlight this a lot in the article. For instance, one study they talk about by Asor, Kaplan, and Roth found that if teachers clearly explain to students why a task is relevant to their goals, that actually does a better job of motivating students to do that task than simply offering them choices about how to do the task.
Right, so it's more about understanding the relevance.
Exactly. It's not just about can I choose, it's do I understand why this is important.
Exactly.
And then Katz and Asor, in their own work, they actually did a follow-up study where they found that students who were placed in a class that matched their existing interests
Right.
actually felt just as autonomous and motivated as students who were given the opportunity to choose their class.
So it was the interest that mattered.
Exactly. And there are other studies like this, like Reynolds and Simons, where they looked at kids doing these information searches.
Yeah.
And they found that giving kids the choice of topic, which is probably, very closely tied to their interests, was far more beneficial for learning than letting them choose how to present what they found.
Right, so the topic choice really made a difference.
Exactly. And then Reeve, Nix, and Ham, they talk about this really interesting distinction between what they call action choices, so like how you choose to spend your time on a task,
Yeah.
versus option choices, like choosing which specific problem to solve.
Right.
And they found that action choices actually had a stronger impact on your sense of autonomy.
It's about the process then.
Exactly. And then Flowerday and colleagues, they actually dug into this idea of picking versus choosing and showed that when you have these empty choices, you're just picking between things that you have no knowledge of. It's actually the interest in the topic that drives learning, not just the act of picking.
Right, so it's not just about having a choice, it's about having a meaningful choice.
Right. And there were several studies where choice had no effect or even a negative effect that I think might fall into this category of picking rather than choosing.
Right. Yeah, like that study where kids got to choose fantasy elements for learning materials,
Yeah.
but the fantasies themselves weren't that interesting.
Right. Or another study where students chose which foreign language words to learn, but everyone was already really motivated to learn the language.
Right, so it's like the choice didn't really matter that much.
Exactly. But then you have these situations where even small, kind of trivial choices seem to have a positive effect.
Mm-hmm.
So, like that study where people thought they could choose how difficult a task would be, even though everyone got the same level of difficulty, those who thought they had a choice actually performed better.
Right, so even just the belief in choice helped.
Right. Or, that classic example of choosing your own lottery ticket, even though it doesn't change the odds of winning, people feel more invested when they get to choose.
Yeah.
And, even when kids get to choose superficial things like the name of a game character, that can actually boost their engagement.
Right. It seems like any choice helps sometimes.
Exactly. So how do we square those sorts of findings with the idea that choice has to be meaningful and related to our goals?
Well, Katz and Asor suggest that there are a few things going on. One is simply the belief in control. Even if the choice is trivial, just the feeling that you have some say over what happens can make you feel more engaged.
Okay.
And then another possibility is that even small choices can help you personalize a task.
Okay, so like naming that game character, you feel more ownership over the experience.
Exactly. And then the final thing they mention is that in Western cultures, at least, choice often carries a positive value.
Okay.
So even the mere act of being offered a choice, even if it's not significant, can tap into these broader cultural associations with freedom and autonomy.
Okay, so there might be a sort of halo effect.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, so that kind of helps us understand when choice supports our need for autonomy. What about competence? That feeling that we're effective and capable. How does choice play into that?
Well, I think one really important concept here is the idea of choice overload.
Okay.
And this is something that I think, we can all relate to.
Yeah, I was going to say, who hasn't experienced this?
Right? Like you go to the grocery store and you're trying to choose a box of cereal.
Right.
And there are just like 50 different options.
Right.
And you end up standing there for like 10 minutes, just completely overwhelmed.
Exactly.
And then you end up either just grabbing the same old thing you always get,
Yeah.
or you just walk away completely.
Right.
And I think that's kind of the essence of choice overload. It's this idea that when you're faced with too many choices
Yeah.
or choices that are too complex, it can actually make you feel less competent.
Right. It's like you said, you just feel overwhelmed and you just kind of freeze.
Right. And there's a lot of research showing that when people are faced with very complex decisions with lots of options, they tend to rely on simpler and often less optimal ways of making decisions.
Okay, so instead of carefully weighing all the options, you might just go with your gut or pick something at random.
Exactly. Or you might just choose the first option that seems okay, rather than really taking the time to consider all the possibilities.
Right, and that can lead to bad decisions.
Right, exactly. And it can also make you feel less competent.
Right, because you didn't really feel like you were in control of the decision-making process.
Exactly. And as a result, people might end up just deferring the decision or sticking with the default option or just not choosing anything at all.
Right.
And even if you do make a choice, you're often less satisfied with it when there are too many options to choose from.
Right. I think that study by Iyengar and Lipper, where they had all the jams and chocolates on display,
Right. Yeah.
really showed this very clearly. That, when people had more options, they were actually less likely to buy anything.
Right. It was demotivating to have too much choice.
Exactly. And they also found the same thing with an optional essay assignment, where people were actually more likely to do the assignment if they had fewer topics to choose from.
Right. So even when it comes to things that are more work, sometimes having fewer choices can actually be more motivating.
Right. So, for our listeners, if you're feeling overwhelmed by all the learning resources that are out there or all the different paths you could take, it might actually be beneficial to try to narrow down your options a bit.
Right. Maybe just start with a few things that seem really interesting to you and go from there.
Exactly. But competence isn't just about avoiding being overwhelmed by choices. Katz and Asor also talk about how choice can be an opportunity to demonstrate competence.
Right.
So, if you're given a choice of how to solve a problem and you successfully come up with a solution that really works, that can make you feel very competent.
Right. It's like I made a good choice and I executed it well.
Exactly. And there's even research showing that when people believe that their choices and their subsequent performance will be seen by others, they actually might perform better,
Right.
suggesting that they're motivated to show that they made a good decision and that they're
Yeah.
capable.
So it's about self-presentation.
Exactly. But there's a potential downside to that, too.
Right. Right. If the focus is solely on proving yourself through your choices, it can create a lot of pressure, and it can actually lead to anxiety and stress.
Right. You might not actually enjoy the process, and it could make you less motivated to engage in those types of choices in the future.
Exactly. And, some studies have actually found that while having control over the pace of your learning can sometimes lead to better learning, it can also make people enjoy the process less.
Right.
If the focus is solely on proving how quickly they can learn something.
Right. It becomes a performance.
Exactly.
And the level of challenge presented by the choices themselves seems important, too.
Yeah, that's really key.
We know from research on motivation that people are most motivated by tasks that are challenging enough to be engaging, but not so challenging that they feel impossible.
Right. It needs to be that sweet spot.
Exactly. So if the choices you're offered are too easy, you're not going to feel like you're accomplishing anything.
Right.
But if they're too difficult, you might just give up before you even start.
Exactly. So the ideal situation is choices that offer a sort of optimal level of challenge where you feel like you're stretching your abilities, but you also feel like you can succeed.
Right. So it's about finding that Goldilocks zone.
Right.
What I thought was really interesting is that the article points out that most of the research on choice hasn't really looked closely at how age affects how we handle choices and the impact on our sense of competence.
Right.
You'd imagine that, a young child's ability to process options would be very different from an adult's.
Absolutely.
Right. But it seems like that's an area that hasn't really been explored in depth.
Right. And Cass and Isser actually point out that it's a bit surprising how often age is overlooked in these studies.
Okay.
Because we know that kids of different ages have very different decision-making skills and different abilities to handle complexity. So it makes sense that the impact of choice on their sense of competence would also vary a lot.
Right. It's not one size fits all. So we've looked at how choice relates to autonomy and competence. What about relatedness? That third fundamental need, that sense of connection and belonging. How does choice fit into that?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, and I think in some ways it's a less obvious connection than the other two needs.
Yeah, it seems a little more indirect.
Right, exactly. And, there's been less research specifically looking at this.
Okay.
But what Katz and Asor emphasize is that the relationship between choice and relatedness is often really shaped by cultural factors.
Okay.
And they bring up this really important work by Marcus and Kitayama, who famously contrasted individualistic Western cultures with more collectivistic Eastern cultures.
Okay. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah. So, in Western cultures, there's a strong emphasis on the individual, on being unique, on being independent, on making your own decisions.
Right.
And choice is often seen as a way to express that individuality.
Right.
But in more collectivist cultures, the focus is more on group harmony and interdependence. And so in these cultures, making a personal choice that goes against the preferences of your group or the values of your group might actually feel like a threat to your sense of belonging.
Okay.
Like if you choose to study something that your family doesn't approve of or that your community doesn't think is appropriate, it can actually create tension in those relationships.
Right.
And that can actually make you feel less connected to those people.
Right.
And, Iyengar and Lepper, they did this really interesting study back in 1999 where they found that European American children were more motivated when they got to make their own choices.
Okay.
But Asian American children actually showed more motivation when an in-group member, like a parent or a classmate, made the choice for them.
Oh, wow. So it was almost the reverse.
Right.
Okay.
And Katz-Assor's own research with secular Jewish children and Bedouin children also found a similar pattern, where choice actually seemed to undermine motivation for the Bedouin children, who were from a more collectivist culture. But it didn't really have this extra motivating effect for the Jewish children, who are from a more individualistic culture.
So it seems like choice can be a double-edged sword, depending on your cultural background.
Right, exactly.
And it's not just about those broadly defined cultural differences. The article also talks about how even in more individualistic societies, the choices we make can have implications for our relatedness.
Right.
If you're in a situation where you're worried that the choices you make will lead to social rejection or you'll be judged negatively by your peers, that can also affect your willingness to embrace those choices.
Right.
And that's really about relatedness, right? It's about our fear of not fitting in.
Exactly. And I think that's something that we all experience to some degree, regardless of our cultural background.
Yeah.
Like if you're in a classroom and you're worried that if you choose to do a project on a certain topic,
Oh, sure.
your classmates will think you're weird.
Right. You might just choose the safe option.
Yeah.
So I think all of this really points to some pretty important takeaways for how we think about offering choices, particularly in learning contexts. It's clear that simply giving someone a ton of options isn't this magical key to motivation that we often think it is.
Right. It's not a guarantee.
Exactly. And it sounds like we really need to be more intentional and thoughtful about how we design and present choices,
Absolutely.
and always kind of keep these three basic needs in mind: the autonomy, competence, and relatedness.
Exactly.
So what would you say are some good guidelines for creating choices that are more likely to satisfy these needs? Let's start with autonomy. How can we support people's sense of autonomy through choice?
Well, I think one key thing is to make sure that the options are actually relevant to the person's interests and goals.
Okay.
So if you're a teacher, you might want to give your students some flexibility in terms of how they approach a task or how their learning is assessed or how they present their understanding.
Okay.
And I think it's also really important to clearly explain why certain tasks are important.
Okay, so it goes back to that relevance piece.
Exactly.
Okay.
And I think the way that choices are presented is also really important. So, using non-controlling language and acknowledging that students might have different feelings or even negative feelings about certain options can also help to support their autonomy.
Okay.
And then finally, I think once someone has made a choice, it's important to avoid interrupting them unnecessarily or imposing too much unsolicited help.
Okay, so kind of let them run with it.
Right, exactly.
Okay, what about competence? How can we design choices to support that feeling of being capable?
Well, I think it's really important to carefully match the complexity and difficulty of the choices to the person's current abilities and their perceived competence.
Oh.
So, if you're introducing new concepts, you might want to start with simpler choices and then gradually increase the complexity as the person's understanding grows.
Okay.
And I think it's also really important to provide clear guidance, break down tasks into manageable steps, and offer regular informative feedback that focuses on their progress and how they can improve.
So it's about scaffolding the experience.
Right, exactly.
Um,
And I think creating a learning environment where it's okay to make mistakes
eh,
and where support is readily available, that's also really important
okay.
because that helps people feel like they can take risks and try new things without fear of failure.
Right. So a safe space to experiment.
Exactly.
Okay. And then lastly, what about relatedness? How can we offer choices in a way that supports our need for connection and belonging?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to creating a learning environment that encourages collaboration, peer support, and empathy.
Okay.
And I think it's also important to try to minimize direct social comparisons and excessive competition.
Okay, so not making it all about who's the best.
Right.
Okay.
Because that can create a lot of anxiety about how your choices are going to be perceived by others.
Right.
And then, in more collectivist cultures, I think it might be beneficial to actually offer options that align with group values, or to emphasize the relevance of the choices to shared goals rather than just focusing on individual preference.
Okay.
And then I think in all contexts, it's really important to create a warm and accepting atmosphere where people don't fear negative social consequences for the choices that they make.
Right. So a space where they feel safe to be themselves.
Exactly.
So I think for our listeners, the big takeaway here is it's not just about whether or not you have choices.
Right.
It's about the quality of those choices and the context in which they're offered.
Right. Exactly. It's about whether or not those choices actually support your basic psychological needs.
Right. And this really makes me think back on all those times when I've felt really energized by having options and all those times when I just felt completely weighed down by them.
Yeah.
And now I have a new framework to understand why. Why certain choices felt so good and why others felt so stifling.
Right. Exactly.
So for you listening, I would really encourage you to think about your own experiences with choice, not just in learning, but really in any area of your life. When did having choices make you feel motivated? When did it make you feel demotivated? And in those situations, which of those needs, the autonomy, competence, or relatedness, do you think were being supported or maybe undermined?
Right. And I think, as Katzenessor point out, while this framework gives us a really powerful lens for understanding the effects of choice, there's still a lot that we don't know.
Right.
More research is definitely needed to explore how different types of choices in different real-world settings impact individuals of different ages, different cultural backgrounds, and so on.
Right. It's not the final word, but it's definitely a very useful way of starting to think about it.
Right.
So maybe instead of asking yourself that basic question, is choice good or is choice bad?
Yeah.
The more helpful question to ask is, what makes choice useful for me?
Right, exactly.
And I think that subtle shift in perspective can really help you to use choice more effectively
Absolutely.
and to move beyond that very simple idea that more is always better.
Right. It's about the quality of the choices, not just the quantity,
Exactly.
and about understanding your own individual needs.
Exactly.